What makes a bad wrestling pay-per-view? Bad matches, certainly, but when a card is loaded with one substandard bout after another with no epic showdowns to counter the balance, then you're probably watching, yes, a bad pay-per-view. But what if there were shoddy production values to make things worse? And what if the main event was marred by a rather disquieting sort of ugliness? Well, chances are you may be watching one of the absolute worst pay-per-views of all time. Forget your crown jewels, your uncensored, and your December to dismembers, because on October 10th, 1999, a rather minuscule portion of the greater wrestling fanbase witnessed the ultimate in squared circle train wrecks. And many more fans have become aware of its infamy in the years since. I'm Jack from Cultaholic, and this is the true story of heroes of wrestling. Professional wrestling enjoyed considerable mainstream popularity in 1999, the scripted mayhem entrenching itself as part of the greater American zeitgeist. The World Wrestling Federation had never been hotter, setting new records for cable TV viewership through Monday Night Raw, scoring a weekly network program in SmackDown, and shattering decade-old marks for pay-per-view buys. Behind two genuine megastars in Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock, the attitude-fueled WWF was a certified phenomenon, occupying space well within the boundaries of the pop culture bubble. WCW, meanwhile, was in the midst of a sharp decline in quality and fan support, but remained viable enough with weekly cable programs and an aging but recognizable main event scene. Though it was losing its luster, WCW was hardly down for the count and still had a sizable fan base to its credit. Rounding out the big three, of course, was ECW, the little promotion that could, landing a cable spot on TNN and now running 6 pay-per-views a year while continuing an ambitious national expansion. Though ECW was in serious financial distress by this time, some remained optimistic that Paul Heyman's band of misfits were fixing to turn the corner sooner or later. Between those 3 promotions, there were 30 pay-per-views in North America in 1999, the most there had ever been in any year to that point. With wrestling on an upswing, enterprising types couldn't help but feel the temptation to muscle their way into an already overcrowded market in search of success. This is the story of one man who tried. There was one other North American wrestling pay-per-view in 1999, and it came away from those established 3 organizations. A gentleman by the name of Bill Stone, then president of the Virginia-based Foss Stone Productions, and later an executive producer for CBS Sports, aimed to capitalize on pro wrestling's dizzying popularity by staging his very own pay-per-view. Dubbed Heroes of Wrestling, Stone's idea was to put on a show featuring the stars of yesteryear that weren't still tied to major promotions. With most prime name-value performers locked up in contracts with the WWF, WCW, and ECW, and also needing bigger names to appeal to the pay-per-view audience, focusing his product on legendary figures did make sense, in theory. Stone was planning on running 3 more pay-per-views over the next year, but this first outing had to go well. For this venture to be profitable, it would need a reported 41,000 pay-per-view buys in order to justify future events of its type. For a venue, Stone secured the ballroom at Casino Magic in Bay St. Louis, Missouri, right on the Gulf Coast. The building had played host to a pair of UFC events over the previous 2 years, drawing over 4,000 patrons for each, so it was a decent-sized venue for a wrestling program. To help assemble the roster and the card, Stone was put in touch with a New York-based promoter named Michael Lombardi, head man at the long-running Northeast Wrestling. Tasked with bringing in viable names to populate this unique pay-per-view, Lombardi began reaching out to a host of older stars and had offers rejected by the likes of Vader, Honky Tonk Man, and Terry Funk. Previously, Stone had reached out to Sid Vicious, who was unable to work the card after signing with WCW that June. The wrestlers who were secured for the event were a who's who of WrestleMania headliners, also some top territory stars and other assorted icons from days gone by. A match pitting Superfly Jimmy Snuka against Cowboy Bob Orton harkened back to the WWF's expansion period of the mid-80s. In a true novelty for fans of the Crockett territory, original Horseman Tully Blanchard would face Midnight Express member Sweet Stan Lane. A whole host of prismatic characters, from the detested Iron Sheik and Nikolai Volkov, to the zany Bushwhackers, to the leather-necked Greg the Hammer Valentine, to the bloodthirsty Abdullah the Butcher, filled out a card that looked to tug at those nostalgic heartstrings. To offset the possible rustiness of the aging stars, a few younger wrestlers were recruited to add a little oomph to the proceedings. 33-year-old Too Cold Scorpio was matched up with a rising indie prospect in 27-year-old Julio Fantastico, who did, by the way, go on to wrestle in both ECW and TNA, the latter in which he formed a team with CM Punk. Men like Marty Jannetty, Tommy Rogers, and Head Shrinker Samu may have been pushing 40 years old, but each still brought something to the table, more so than some of their contemporaries that were deeper into their 40s or 50s, or in the case of George the Animal Steel, 60s. The double main event was hardly short on recognizable faces. In one half, the renowned but troubled Jake the Snake Roberts was set to take on Jim the Anvil Neidhard. Then, in a battle of gargantuan Hulkamania villains, King Kong Bundy would face the even larger Yokozuna. Overall, it may not sound like the best show from a quote-unquote work rate standpoint, but as a celebration of territory and Federation expansion era pro wrestling, Heroes of Wrestling had the potential to hit that sweet spot for fans of a certain age. So, how did Heroes of Wrestling do? Let's first discuss the good things. Dutch Mantell, the future Zeb Coulter of course, did a great job on commentary. Also, Tully Blanchard cut one hell of a promo, hyping his match with Stan Lane. And Scorpio and Fantastico's match featured some really impressive high spots, with Scorpio demonstrating why he was one of the better veteran free agents on the market. That's that out of the way. Now let's discuss the bad, because, there's gonna be a lot of it. It begins, as many unflattering tales do, with lots of disorganization. For one thing, talent were apparently late getting in, with several of them missing flights. There were plans to hold a production meeting at 9 AM on the morning of the show, only for it to be pushed back to 11 AM and then 1 in the afternoon as a result of ongoing disarray. Lombardi later noted that short staffing led to a number of individuals having to multitask in the run-up to the show. Assembling the production was made extremely difficult with such a meager behind-the-scenes crew, and it contributed to a very chaotic day. NWA senior referee Fred Richards later noted, "The biggest problem was that they didn't want to bring us in a day early, so we didn't have a chance to get agents and set up the show as it should have been. It was like an indie show, and it showed." The indie level production was made abundantly clear in the program's aesthetic. Shoddy camera work, murky audio, an uninspired arena setup, minimalist lighting, you name it. Heroes of Wrestling came off looking like an oversized indie rather than an outfit worthy of a pay-per-view telecast. No one was expecting, a gaudy entrance set like those on Raw and Nitro at the time, but this made ECW on hardcore TV look like turn-of-the-century SmackDown. It was amateur hour on site. Even if the matches themselves had ended up being spectacularly thrilling exhibitions, Heroes of Wrestling would still have been criticized for its low-rent production. Then, there was the commentary. Play-by-play honors went to a man named Randy Rosenblum, an acquaintance of Stone's. An award-winning multi-sports broadcaster with experience calling events like the Olympic Games and Wimbledon, Rosenblum unfortunately had little product knowledge or fundamental understanding when it came to, wrestling. While knowing nothing about wrestling could get you hired by some promotions, as we've seen in the past, it doesn't make for an enriching TV experience when you're supposed to be the lead voice. And Rosenblum was clearly out of his element. Whether it was bungling the names of moves like calling a dropkick a flying leg kick, or naturally recoiling at the bloodshed in one match, Rosenblum's years of experience calling tennis and college football hadn't exactly prepared him for this. For Rosenblum's partner, the original choice was the legendary Gordon Solie. Unfortunately, Solie was in declining health due to throat cancer, which he would sadly pass away from the following year. Solie's name was still listed in the pay-per-view intro, but no explanation was given as to why he wasn't there. Ted DiBiase was reportedly the backup choice for Rosenblum's partner, but he was unable to attend due to other commitments. The spot ended up going to the aforementioned Dutch Mantell, who in fairness did admirably carry a mystified Rosenblum through the broadcast. More mystifying though were the matches themselves. It's to be expected that when you're putting on what is, for all intents and purposes, an old-timers game, that the spring in the step isn't going to be there for most of the participants. Not every 50-something athlete is going to look like shredded Mike Tyson killing it in a training session. But whatever the minimal acceptable standard for a passable wrestling match is in most people's eyes, Heroes of Wrestling didn't exactly hit that threshold. Some matches were fine, if unspectacular, like Blanchard vs. Lane, Jannetty and Rogers vs. the Samoan SWAT team, and Scorpio vs. Fantastico, which I guess is the default match of the night. But the rest of them, oh dear. Maybe it didn't help that the wrestlers were allegedly served alcohol throughout the night by casino staffers against the wishes of Lombardi the booker. It's not clear if any beer clouds hindered the action that followed, but it might have explained a few things. Greg Valentine versus George Steele went 6.5 minutes, and that was arguably, 6 minutes too long. The story centered around sensational Sherry seconding George Steele, only to continuously help out Valentine behind the oblivious animal's back. Age 62 at the time of the show, Steele wasn't going to be doing much, and the smoke and mirrors didn't enhance the match any either. A match between the Bushwhackers and Sheik and Volkov went almost 9 minutes and has been hailed as one of the worst matches of all time by those who personally witnessed it. Like Valentine and Steele, the aging wrestlers were well past their prime and couldn't do much outside of slowed down, clunky basics. Where Stone apparently began to have second thoughts about his pay-per-view was in a match pitting Abdullah the Butcher against the one-man gang. If you've seen one Abdullah match, you know the routine. Lots of gouging with his trusty fork when he isn't throat thrusting and knee dropping, and that's pretty much how it goes. And seeing as these two super heavyweights weren't going to be taking many bumps, especially Abdullah at 58 years old, all they could really do to make this a spectacle was to have something that vaguely resembled a hardcore match. One Man Gang used his chain, Abdullah naturally used his fork, and both men bled their way to a merciful double countout. According to Lombardi, Stone was freaked out by the bloodshed in that match. Blood was hardly an uncommon sight in pro wrestling in 1999 or in any Abdullah the Butcher match like ever, but apparently Stone wasn't thrilled with the skin ripping that had just transpired before his eyes. And if that was the worst thing that would have happened on that night, then maybe Heroes of Wrestling wouldn't have gone down in history for all the wrong reasons. But there's still the double main event left to go. Following the Snuka-Orton match, it was to be Roberts versus Neidhard and then Yokozuna versus Bundy to close the show. According to a 2000 column written by Alex Marvez, yes, my boy, Alex Marvez, Neidhard had missed several flights the day of the event and barely even made it to the pay-per-view for his match with Jake the Snake. The Yoko versus Bundy match was hampered by the fact that neither man would agree to lose via pinfall, so unless something drastic happened, the final match of the night would go off without a conclusive ending. But all of this, unfortunately, was mere child's play to the situation involving Jake Roberts. A word of warning, of course, to those who don't know what's coming, because this next part will discuss some pretty upsetting things. Without making light of Roberts' situation, obviously, it's honest to say that Jake's appearance at Heroes of Wrestling has been subject to much derision and ridicule in the years since. Most wrestling fans are well aware of the demons that Roberts has struggled with for decades, to the point where most were relieved to see Jake survive long enough to achieve sobriety and thankfully get his life in order. In 1999, however, Jake was still deep in the throes of his troubles, and that was never clearer to the general public than in his appearance here. According to the Wrestling Observer newsletter, Roberts diligently pitched in to help the event out in the days beforehand, doing promo work, and was apparently of sound body, mind, and spirit all the way through. However, apparently Roberts received word on the day of the pay-per-view that his ex-wife was seeking a substantial amount of money in child support and was faced with going back to jail if he didn't come up with it. As the Observer reported, Roberts disappeared into his private dressing room and emerged as a new person. This was evident in Roberts' promo preceding the match with Neidhard. And more than anything else, this is what Heroes of Wrestling is, sadly, most known for. Slurring his words and using interviewer Michael St. John to physically lean on, Roberts rambled incoherently about gambling, different casino games, the prospect of losing, and the peril, of course, of facing his snake Damien. Then there was the match, if you want to call it that. Roberts had an extended entrance, though clearly not by design. He made his way down the aisle, went back to the locker room, then came back out again for seemingly no reason. Then, after an awkward interaction with some ringsiders, Roberts took Damien out of the bag, stuck it between his legs, and, you can picture what happened. Well, it's probably on screen now. An audible was called during this entire debacle as Bundy was dispatched to the ring to help Neidhard attack Jake. The plan was for Roberts versus Neidhard to eventually turn into a tag match involving Bundy and Yoko anyway, but Roberts, being in no condition to work, just accelerated things to point B much quicker. Roberts was originally supposed to defeat Neidhard in the singles bout, but Neidhard was now apparently refusing to do the job, with a reported WWF job waiting for him in the future. With all the confusion over most of the participants refusing to lose, Roberts volunteered to take the pin just for the sake of peace. Roberts did indeed take the fall, losing to a Bundy splash following 16.5 minutes of objectively terrible action. To send the crowd home happy, Jake and Yoko manhandled a stagehand named Michael Henry, who was dubbed Mini Bundy due to his resemblance to the big wrestler. And then Roberts laid Damien the Snake over the top of his crumpled body. The final shot of the night was of the snake crawling over poor Mini Bundy. Rosenblum and Mantell were mid-sentence when the pay-per-view abruptly faded out. Reportedly, Stone ordered the director to cut there and then, fearing whatever Roberts might do next in his inebriated state. It was the end of perhaps the worst wrestling pay-per-view that has ever been commissioned. In his review of the event in The Observer, Meltzer rated 5 of the 8 matches in the negatives, while Blanchard vs. Lane took home the bronze medal with just a dud rating, which honestly was pretty good on the night by that average. Scorpio vs. Fantastico was his pick for match of the night at a whopping 1.25 stars. On the Cage Match fan database online, Heroes of Wrestling, as of this video, holds a 0.66 rating out of a possible 10, with more than 80% of users giving it a 0. Sources have the event as drawing between 27,000 and 32,000 buys, short of the desired 41,000 buy threshold needed to turn a worthwhile profit. The crowd of just 2,300 in Bay St. Louis was also littered with tons of freebies. Though Stone and company did reportedly break even on the venture, he had very little interest in trying again. Reflecting several months following the pay-per-view, Stone said, "I don't think senior wrestling works. Obviously, when some of these guys are brought into what WCW and WWF does with them by making them just a part of things, I think it does work, but as a standalone event, it didn't work." He went on to say, "I also think the show could have been better, but even if it was, we still didn't have enough people watching it anyway." Plus, Stone had other headaches. A retrospective of the event by John Corrigan of the Wrestling Estate sheds some light on legal issues that Stone's company faced. Though announcers and production materials did everything possible to avoid calling Yokozuna, the Bushwhackers, and others by their WWF trademark names, a source from Fosstone Productions claims that the WWF legal department informed Stone that action was forthcoming days following the pay-per-view. Stone reportedly expressed to the WWF reps that he had no desire to run another Heroes of Wrestling event, upon which WWF decided not to pursue legal action. The stress of the event itself was enough for Stone to throw in the towel. He added, "I thought we would have a friendly product, but instead guys were trying to bleed and we had a drunk guy with a snake between his legs. While the show was going on, I started thinking, when does the plane leave?" Today, Heroes of Wrestling lives on as an occasional punchline, feeling almost like surreal folklore at times. While most of the performers involved are viewed fondly today, especially a cleaner and healthier Jake the Snake Roberts, Hero of Wrestling is an event that doesn't really wash so easily. A disorganized mess of a production marred further by over-the-hill performers, bargain basement production, and a rock-bottom main event combined to ensure that Heroes of Wrestling has its unique place in pro wrestling infamy.